Samantha had always been independent, but when her parents left for a week-long vacation, she felt a twinge of apprehension. Their house was old, creaky, and filled with dark corners that seemed to whisper secrets. The first night, she locked all the doors and windows, trying to reassure herself that everything was fine. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, Samantha heard a noise coming from the basement. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking gently on a door. She froze, heart pounding. Maybe it was just the old house settling, she thought. But the noise continued, growing louder and more insistent. Summoning her courage, Samantha grabbed a flashlight and made her way downstairs. The basement door was slightly ajar, and the thumping sound echoed eerily through the hallway. She pushed the door open and descended the stairs, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Halfway down, she felt a sudden chill. A cold spot, colder than the rest of the basement, made her shiver. The thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Samantha scanned the room with her flashlight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. In the corner of the basement, half hidden behind some old furniture, was an antique trunk she had never noticed before. Dusty and worn, it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Curious, she approached it, her flashlight flickering as she neared. As she reached out to open the trunk, she heard a faint whisper. It was so quiet she almost missed it. "Help me," it seemed to say. Samantha jerked her hand back, fear prickling her skin. She backed away slowly, not daring to turn her back on the trunk. Fleeing the basement, Samantha locked the door behind her and raced back to her room. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the fear lingered. She barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The next morning, Samantha decided to stay out of the house as much as possible. She spent the day with friends, returning home only when it was absolutely necessary. But as soon as night fell, the fear returned, gnawing at her nerves. On the third night, Samantha saw something that made her blood run cold. As she was lying in bed, she noticed a shadow moving in the hallway outside her room. It was tall and thin, shifting unnaturally. She stared in horror as it crept closer to her door. Paralyzed with fear, Samantha couldn't bring herself to move. The shadow stopped just outside her door, and for a moment she thought it might pass by. But then the door began to creak open, slowly and ominously. The shadow entered her room, and Samantha could finally see it clearly. It was a figure, dark and indistinct, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. It moved towards her bed, and she could feel the air grow colder with each step. Desperate, Samantha remembered the whisper from the basement trunk. Summoning all her courage, she leapt out of bed and ran downstairs. She threw open the basement door and raced to the trunk, yanking it open with trembling hands. Inside the trunk was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. The first entry was dated over 100 years ago, detailing the life of a man who had once lived in the house. He wrote of an evil presence that tormented him, a shadow that seemed to come from the very walls. The last entry described a ritual to banish the entity. Samantha quickly gathered the necessary items: salt, a candle, and a mirror. She set them up as described, chanting the words written in the journal. The shadow loomed closer, its form twisting angrily. As she completed the ritual, the shadow let out an unearthly scream and vanished. The house fell silent, the oppressive air lifting. Samantha collapsed, exhausted but relieved. She knew the entity was gone, but the memory of those terrifying nights would haunt her forever. Lisa had just moved into a quaint little house on the outskirts of town. It was a fresh start after a tough breakup, and she was excited to make the place her own. Her first night alone, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. Around midnight, a soft knock at the window startled her awake. She lived in a single-story house, and the bedroom window faced the backyard. Lisa brushed it off as a tree branch or some animal and went back to sleep. The next night, she heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. Her heart raced as she strained to listen. The footsteps stopped right outside her window, followed by that same soft knock. Lisa held her breath, too scared to move. Gathering her courage, she peeked through the blinds. A man stood there, his face partially obscured by the darkness. His eyes glinted menacingly in the moonlight, and a twisted smile spread across his lips. Lisa gasped and stumbled back, but when she looked again, he was gone. Panicked, she called the police. They arrived quickly, searched the property, but found no sign of the intruder. They reassured her it was probably a prank or a trespasser, and promised to patrol the area more frequently. The following day, Lisa tried to go about her routine, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she walked her dog in the nearby park, she spotted the same man in the distance, standing still and staring at her. She hurried home, heart pounding. That night, Lisa barricaded herself in her bedroom, clutching a kitchen knife. The knock came again, louder this time. She could hear the man whispering her name, his voice chillingly close. Summoning her courage, she called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" There was no response, just that eerie whisper of her name. The police arrived again, but found nothing. Lisa showed them the footprints outside her window, but they were fading fast in the night dew. The officers promised to keep a close watch, but seemed skeptical. Determined to find answers, Lisa searched the house for clues. In the attic, she found an old journal belonging to the previous owner. The entry spoke of a man who had become obsessed with the owner's daughter, stalking her relentlessly until she moved away. The journal ended abruptly, but not before mentioning that the man had vowed to find his beloved no matter where she went. Lisa realized with horror that the stalker had returned, mistaking her for the previous owner's daughter. Lisa decided to set a trap. She installed security cameras around the property and set up a motion detector by her window. That night, she waited in the dark, knife in hand, praying the police would arrive in time. The knock came again, and the motion detector's alarm blared. The cameras captured the man's face in startling clarity. He was older now, but the same sinister smile twisted his features. Lisa called the police, who arrived within minutes and apprehended the man. When the police questioned him, the man confessed to everything. He had been watching Lisa, believing her to be his lost love reincarnated. He had planned to reunite with her, and his intentions were far from benign. The man was taken into custody, and a restraining order was issued. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though she knew he was behind bars. She installed more security measures and tried to move on, but the fear lingered. Months passed, and Lisa slowly began to feel safe again. She made new friends, redecorated the house, and started to rebuild her life. But every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of a shadow outside her window, and her heart would skip a beat, a reminder of the nightmare she had lived through. Emily and her husband, Mark, had just purchased their dream house in the quiet town of Ridgewood. The house was a charming Victorian, complete with ornate woodwork and a wraparound porch. They were thrilled to start their new life there. Shortly after moving in, Mark was called away on a business trip. Emily, excited to have the house to herself, planned to spend the week decorating and exploring their new home. The first night, she felt a sense of adventure and freedom. As she unpacked boxes, Emily noticed a faint melody drifting through the house. It sounded like an old music box, the tune hauntingly beautiful. She followed the sound to the attic, where she found an antique music box sitting on a dusty shelf. Curious, she wound it up and watched as it played. The melody was the same she had heard, but the music box was broken, its gears barely turning. She placed it back on the shelf, unsettled by the eerie coincidence. Exploring further, Emily discovered a small door at the back of the attic, locked and covered in cobwebs. She searched the house for a key, finally finding it in an old desk drawer. Her hands trembled as she turned the key and opened the door. Inside was a child's bedroom, perfectly preserved. Toys were scattered on the floor, and a small bed was neatly made. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender, and a sense of sadness permeated the room. Emily felt an inexplicable chill. On the bedside table was a diary, its pages yellowed with age. Emily opened it and began to read. It belonged to a little girl named Alice, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Her entries spoke of loneliness and a mysterious friend who visited her at night. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she heard the soft padding of footsteps outside her door. She sat up, heart racing, and saw a shadow pass by. She called out, thinking it was her imagination, but there was no response. The next day, Emily continued reading the diary. Alice wrote about a shadowy figure that would come to her room, playing with her toys and whispering secrets. The more Emily read, the more she felt a connection to the little girl. That night, Emily was awoken by the sound of a child's laughter. She followed the sound to the attic, where she found the music box playing on its own. The locked room's door was ajar, and she could see a figure moving inside. Summoning her courage, Emily stepped into the room. The figure turned to face her, revealing the pale, ghostly form of a little girl. Alice's eyes were wide with fear, and she whispered, "He's coming!" Emily felt a cold hand grip her heart. Before she could react, the room grew colder, and a dark, malevolent presence filled the space. Emily could feel its anger and hatred. She backed away, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The shadowy figure loomed closer. Desperate, Emily grabbed the music box and wound it up. The melody filled the room, and for a moment, the dark presence hesitated. Using the distraction, she forced the door open and fled, the ghostly laughter echoing behind her. Determined to understand what she had experienced, Emily delved into the house's history. She discovered that Alice had died under mysterious circumstances, and her father, driven mad by grief, had performed dark rituals to bring her back. Instead, he had summoned something evil. With the help of a local historian and a spiritual medium, Emily performed a cleansing ritual. The dark presence fought back, but in the end, it was banished. Alice's spirit found peace, and the house was quiet once more. Emily and Mark stayed, their dream home restored, but the memories of those terrifying nights would stay with Emily forever.